Welcome back. All right, so it is power rankings time yet again. The first power rankings of 2025. So that's kind of fun. And I'm using a new puck set today. So should be very clear. I shouldn't be hearing, I can't tell which teams are which. Starting with number 32, dropping 4 spots from last week, Chicago. I don't know that there's anybody that's playing really bad right now. And I think the fact that Chicago's at the bottom of the board tells you, because Chicago's played relatively well recently. I think we're in an era right now, at least we're at a point in the season where anybody can beat anybody has become reality. Because we talk about that all the time, but it feels like right now, yeah, anybody can beat anybody, and Chicago ends up being 32nd. 31st, dropping 1 spot from last week, Buffalo. Yeah, Buffalo pulled their way up to 30th last week, and then they go on the road and predictably lose a couple of games that, in the case of the Colorado game, they should have won that game, and they didn't because they buffaloed it. Tonight, they didn't even want to have that lead. They didn't want to have that hope, I guess. Sure, we'll make that sound like it was intentional. Buffalo, maybe they're exhausted at the end of a road trip. Maybe that's part of what we saw tonight, or just Vegas could be that good. So, number 31 this week is the Buffalo Sabres. Number 30, dropping 4 spots from last week, the New York Rangers. They get the win over Boston, but they're making mistakes. They're not getting any kind of momentum towards a playoff spot. They're now under 500. They're falling further out of contention for a playoff spot at this point. So, yeah, it's not a pretty picture that's being drawn right now by the New York Rangers. And if you're a Rangers fan, you're probably not watching the power rankings, or at the very least, probably not watching them for that long. 30th spot. That's the lowest the Rangers have been in a very long time on a power rankings. It just doesn't look like they're pulling themselves out of this mess. Number 29 this week, same spot as last week for Nashville. They did have a couple of wins at the end of the week. Overall, the picture for Nashville is not a lot better than what it has been, but if they can start winning on the road more regularly, you never know. The season's young enough that maybe they could pull themselves. And if I hear one more commentator talk about, well, remember St. Louis in 2019? Yeah, that was now 5 years ago. And, it just feels like we hear that all the time now. Is, well, remember now, St. Louis, you can't count a team out because, St. Louis, okay, it was in January, because all the commentators. All right, number 28 this week, moving up 3 spots from last week, the San Jose Sharks. What's weird is that San Jose was playing some really fun hockey. And then they started playing losing hockey. And it wasn't much fun to watch. This week they win a couple of games. They're tight games, but they win them. And they've looked better again. So for San Jose, it's working. It's a process. It's just I think it's a little bit slower than fans might have hoped with how well they were playing earlier in the season. But they've started getting results again. We'll see whether or not this is sustainable and whether or not they can pull themselves out of the bottom row. Number 27, dropping 2 spots from last week, the New York Islanders. The Islanders just not winning enough games, and if you don't win enough games, you drop on a power rankings. That should be how it works. It's not always the case. There are times where a team will lose some games. They don't necessarily move down, just the same as a team might win some games and not necessarily move up. It's going to depend on a lot of factors. So for the Islanders, they find themselves dropping down to 27th spot this week. Number 26, dropping 7 spots from last week, Philadelphia. There was an article Kevin Kurz wrote I think yesterday, on Kolosov not being an NHL level goaltender. I'm starting to wonder if the Philadelphia Flyers are trying to get another really good draft pick, and if the goaltending is intentionally the way that it is. Now I know Harrison's been hurt. I know that they've had injury issues, but there are goaltenders out there if they decide they need one. So I'm going to agree that Kolosov's play hasn't been great lately, and that just the goaltending, and they're meandering. So they end up dropping 7 spots this week because I just felt like other teams were playing better than they are right now, and the goaltending is an issue for Philadelphia. Number 25 this week, moving up 7 spots from last week. So they were dead last week, and one of the biggest movers. They are not the only one that moved up 7 spots. They are not. The Detroit Red Wings move up to 25th. You change the coach, you get that bump. The question for Detroit is, are they going to be able to maintain this? Keep in mind, I picked them as a team that should be able to make the playoffs this year. So while I've been rough on them in the power rankings because they haven't been playing well, I'd like to see them turn it around and get above that playoff line. So, big win tonight over the Winnipeg Jets. They need to build on that. Maybe they can. Maybe Todd McClellan was the answer. Number 24, dropping one spot from last week, Columbus. Columbus is sitting at NHL 500. And there's definitely space there for somebody to jump above that playoff line who might have a mediocre record. Maybe it'll be Columbus. Maybe it'll be Montreal. There's definitely an opening there should teams decide to go for that. If Columbus can play on the road the way that they play at home, I think they're a pretty good team. And I've said this before. I think Columbus has a better team than their record. And I think that they could start putting wins together in the second half. They just have to stay close to a playoff spot, and you just never know. But Columbus this week is 24. Number 23, also dropping one spot from last week, is St. Louis. Now, I know that Columbus beat St. Louis. St. Louis is still one game above NHL 500. I didn't see the need to switch the two teams in their places today based on this one game. We'll see what happens in upcoming weeks. But yeah, St. Louis and Columbus both dropped the one spot. So Blues and Blue Jackets right next to one another as they were tonight. And Columbus came out with the victory. And we'll see what happens in upcoming weeks. St. Louis is the team that I did the video on the top four teams in the Central. And there were a lot of comments of, hey, St. Louis could get up there with them too. But St. Louis hasn't been able to have a sustainable run. And they have to have like 5 or 6 wins out of 7. Something like that in order to really contend for one of those top 4 spots because it's not easy to get there. It's a 600 plus point percentage for all 4 of those teams, and St. Louis is flirting with 500. Number 22 this week, moving up 5 spots from last week, Anaheim. So Detroit, I think, can definitely have a really strong second half. I'm going to go ahead and say, you know what? Keep an eye on the Anaheim Ducks. This is a team that has won their share of games. Sure, there might be a fluky nature to a win here and there, but they're getting goaltending. Their defense has been good, and I think they're better than people give them credit for. I know that there's been a lot of hype about San Jose because of Celebrini, and I'm not going to deny that at all, but I think people are sleeping on the Anaheim Ducks, which I get because they've had trouble putting the puck in the ocean this year. But they've started to get wins. And you can see that confidence is starting to rise for some of those players. We'll see what happens in the second half of the season. Number 21, same spot as last week, Seattle. As I mentioned in the review tonight, they have to start playing in the first period like they've been playing in third periods. They're a good team. They just can't be falling behind the way they've been falling behind recently. So for Seattle, that's the thing. Start on time, play the first period the way you've been playing your third periods, and you might find yourself above the playoff line in the West, where there's definitely an opening for a team to jump in there, grab a spot, and stay there. Maybe it'll end up being Seattle, but they have to get above 500, and they have to start, ending up in position. They have to start not ending up in a position where they're trailing after the first, or especially after the second, where they have to play catch up. You're expending a lot of energy, and in today's NHL, even though there's a lot of comebacks, you don't want to be relying on that all the time. Number 20 this week, dropping 2 spots, Vancouver. There's the real possibility I could wake up in the morning to a trade. There is. Elliot Friedman reported tonight the Vancouver Canucks could move Miller or they could move Pettersson, and they're looking for center in return, which would make sense since both Pettersson and Miller can and have played center. I think of the two, I think Miller probably ends up going, but Miller reportedly, according to Nick Kyprios, is only willing to waive his no trade or no movement clause for the Rangers. He's earned the right to that, so we'll see what happens. If Pettersson ends up being traded, it's going to be a massive trade. If Miller ends up being traded, it's going to be a massive trade. And you know what? The team might need that. That might be what the Canucks need. I'm sorry, I coughed. The Canucks, I guess I'm talking about the Canucks, and just choking happens. No idea why. Totally unrelated. But I've been getting very angry watching the Canucks lately. The team needs a change. I don't even necessarily worry about why. I trust Patrick Allvin. He's been very good at trades, so we'll see what happens with the Canucks. But that's the word right now. Number 19, moving up 1 spot from last week, Pittsburgh. So the Penguins move up one spot because the Canucks drop. The Penguins keeping themselves at NHL 500. Go look at the standings and see how many teams are all within basically touching distance of one another. And you're there, and you're back there, and we're tied with you. All these teams are right next to each other in the standings. It's great. It is. It leads to a lot of scoreboard watching in the second half of the season. However, one thing that could be adversely affected is maybe we won't have as many sellers at the deadline as we normally do. There will be some GMs that are in this pack that are going to say, hey, this is the year we're going to sell. But there might be some teams that look and go, you know what, we're close, maybe. And Pittsburgh would be one of those teams. They have a lot of veterans. If they can add and go for it, I think they're going to try. Number 18, dropping one spot from last week, Calgary. The loss tonight against Nashville cost them. That's a tough one. Nashville having that good road trip, but Flames need to win that. That's not one that you can lose on home ice. You have to go out there and win those games. And for the Flames, what's helped them is that the Canucks aren't playing well either. So it's definitely left it where the Flames could end up getting into a playoff spot and staying there. I believe they're still above the line tonight. Pretty sure they're still above the line tonight. I don't think anybody was ready to pass them as of yet. But they're not locking that spot down. And that's what they should be doing, is locking that spot down and making sure that, if the Canucks do make a big trade, that it's not easy for them to jump back above the line. But we're not there at this point. Number 17, also moving up 7 spots this week. The same amount of spots that Detroit moves up, and that's Montreal. Yeah, the Montreal Canadiens. Almost in the top half of the board. Close. I know there'll be some Habs fans that aren't happy they're not in the top half, and they'll argue they should be in the top 10 because of who they beat this past week, which I'm not going to say that they're not playing well, because they are. They've moved up 7 spots. Just power rankings aren't generally designed so that you move all the way up to the top row after a good week, because then you're rendering the power rankings basically worthless at that point. Which is why teams go through slow moves up and down the board, and it just seems like when I'm reading the comments here and there, people don't understand that part of it. Like, well, my team had all these wins. Why did they only move up a few spots? Because that's kind of how that works. But for Montreal, it's not just that they're winning, it's who they're defeating. Florida, Tampa, and now Colorado. The funny part being the only loss was against Chicago. But even with that loss to Chicago, I wasn't going to penalize them, because look who they've beaten on this road trip. It's been kind of impressive to watch. So that's the first half of the board. Got the first half done. We're going to move up to 16th now, dropping 1 spot from last week. Ottawa. The Sens just dropped the 1 spot. I said in the reviews with Ottawa's games, it just looked like they were exhausted from the road trip. But for Ottawa, they dropped the 1 spot. We'll see this coming week how things go and whether or not they're able to stay above that playoff line. I'm pretty sure they're still in a playoff spot as I'm recording this. But I do know that with all the games that have been played over the last few days, it's possible that either somebody's really close or somebody's passed them. But yeah, Ottawa, I still think they have the inside track on that last playoff spot in the East, but we shall see. Number 15, and dropping 3 spots from last week, Boston. Boston looked home and cooled last week at this time. Even 2 weeks ago, we could have said, well, looks like Boston's a playoff team this year. But are they? The loss tonight in Toronto, I think that's their 3rd loss in a row. And so I do have some questions and some concerns about the Boston Bruins. And they've dropped a few spots this week. We'll see if they drop again this upcoming week. As a fan of the team, I'd rather they didn't, but it's possible it could happen. Boston finds themselves at 15th this week and not looking quite as home and cooled for playoffs as they did a week ago. Number 14, moving up 2 spots from last week, is Utah. Utah's been back and forth. They did get a point tonight in Dallas. I actually thought they played pretty well in that game against Dallas, so I wasn't going to bust them down for that one, which is also something that I do talk about in these power rankings videos. Just because a team loses doesn't mean they move down. Just because a team wins doesn't mean they move up. This is where me watching all the games comes in, where I can say, well, that team lost tonight, but they played well. And I thought Utah played well tonight. They got the point. They got to overtime. And with all of the uncertainty in the West, maybe they end up getting a spot. But again, we shall see. All right. Number 13 on the board this week, dropping 6 spots from last week, is Tampa. Hey, it's a rough week for them. They lose against San Jose, they lose against LA, and it just looked like they were having a lot of struggles with scoring. This trip through California, it depends on which team you're looking at this year. Some teams have gone through California and swept it. Some teams have gone through California and had a rough time of it. And Tampa Bay is one of those teams that's been having a rough time of it. I will say this, and this harkens back to last season with Carolina. That 3 time zone difference when you're going to the west or to the east is difficult. And so it does ring as an excuse, but I think it is something to take into consideration. So maybe Tampa Bay jumps right back up. One thing Tampa Bay's done this year is when I move them down, I usually end up moving them right back up the week after. Number 12, and moving up 2 spots from last week, Dallas. You never know what you're getting with Dallas. They're very unpredictable. But one thing with them on this board, it feels like they've been in this range of like 11 to 14 for a while. But Dallas, they do move up this week. They're not top 10 yet. So for people keeping track at home, the teams that I root for are 12th, 15th, and 20th on the board. So I'm not having the kind of season I did last year. Last year, that was fun. That's why I said last year I was enjoying that regular season for what it was. I enjoyed that entire regular season. It was the most fun I've had watching hockey in the regular season. I do not identify with these people that say, I'm not enjoying the regular season. I'm just going to wait for the playoffs. Don't, because sometimes the playoffs are just depressing. Number 10, dropping one, or 11, I should say, dropping 1 spot from last week is Carolina. So the Canes have been up and down. Aren't they still 5-5 in their last 10? And it feels like they've been 5-5 in their last 10 for a while. But this is where that really good start comes in handy. The teams that get those really good starts in October and early November have that padding at the top of the standings, so that when they go through these rough patches where they're not winning as often, they have that padding. They don't have to worry about falling below the playoff line, at least not immediately falling below the playoff line. But Carolina's going to be a playoff team. We know that. Carolina does feel like might be one of those teams that maybe they're pacing themselves a little bit and looking towards the playoffs maybe a little bit more than some of the other teams on this board, because we know Carolina can get pretty far in the playoffs, but not quite far enough. Number 10, moving up 1 spot from last week, Minnesota. I will say this with Minnesota. They've been doing well enough without Kaprizov and well enough without some of their big names that I think in the second half of the season, should they get healthy again, Minnesota's going to be very dangerous. I did do that video earlier this season on Minnesota and my view that they're a contending team for the Cup. I still feel that way, even though they've had a rougher time of it over the last few weeks here. But they have to be healthy to do that. Unlike some of the other teams on the board, the injuries seem to impact them a little bit more. But yeah, Minnesota's still top 10. And they're getting wins without some of their big names. So don't sleep on them. Number 9 this week, moving up 4 spots from last week, Colorado. The Avs are almost in the top row. It's close. It's as close as they've been in a while. And I think they're playing well. Now, tonight they lose against Montreal in a shootout. But Stobesh, it's just this weird thing going on with Montreal right now, where they look pretty darn good. We'll see whether or not they can maintain that. But yeah, Colorado's 9th on the board this week, moving up 4 spots. They're just playing very, very well. They almost lost that one against Buffalo, but they showed that they can come back and how good they are at coming back in games. Colorado, Las Vegas. I'm trying to think. There are teams that no matter what the score is, I never put an updated record at the top of the board. Like I'll do that with some games just so I don't forget. With Colorado, I never assume the result. Even if they're down like 4-0 in the third, I'm like, we'll see what happens. Because I know it's Colorado. Number 8, one of those teams that I never count out is Florida. They stay in the same spot as last week. Florida Panthers. So number 8 for them in back-to-back weeks. But are Florida going to be really dangerous in the playoffs? Absolutely. And for Florida, they're going to get the offense going at some point soon, I would think, and pretty much just make the rest of the league regret it. So if anybody's saying, well, it looks like Florida's out of gas, I'm not saying that, because we've seen this before. Last season at points in time they didn't necessarily look great. Then they heated up going to the playoffs and they won the Stanley Cup. Number 7 this week, dropping 4 spots from last week, New Jersey. Not having fun going through California at all. So for the New Jersey Devils, they're still a top team in the East. They still have a very good record. It's not as good as it was before the trip through California. Now they're going to Seattle next. The good news for them would be that Seattle's had its struggles. The funny thing is, Seattle keeps falling behind. So does New Jersey. So does anybody score first? Is it going to just be a turnover fest trying to figure out who's going to score first? At any rate, New Jersey, fingers crossed that they can turn it around in the upcoming week. But they do drop to number 7 this week. And if they have a week like the one they just had, they're going to have a hard time staying ahead of Florida, Colorado, Minnesota, and Carolina, and maybe even Dallas. The top 13 teams on this board are all pretty good. I think you can make a Stanley Cup argument for anybody in the top 13. I'll go that far. Number 6, dropping 2 spots from last week, Winnipeg. There was a power rankings I saw yesterday that had Winnipeg at number 1. I guess I'm just really hard on them. I know part of it is they have a very strong record because they won 15 of their first 16. And it is very similar to what I said earlier about Carolina. They get that very good record, and then you can have your meanderings. You can lose a game against Detroit. And it's not really the end of the world. But then the questions come in about whether or not Winnipeg peaked too early, all that fun stuff. And for me, I think 6 spots the right place for Winnipeg this week. After that loss against Detroit, I expect them to come out with a lot of fire and really play well in the next game. Because if they don't, they may find themselves down in the second round next week as well. Number 5, moving up 4 spots from last week, Toronto. Toronto's been winning some games. They looked really good. They move up to number 5. There you go. In the first 4 games, they played without Austin Matthews. They were 1-3. Then they start winning. Matthews comes back. They beat Boston tonight. Now they're up to number 5 on the board. The Toronto Maple Leafs are underrated by some, and I say that because everybody will say the same thing. Right. What's going to happen in the playoffs? And so you can use that to cut down almost anything Toronto does during the regular season. It's something we've discussed over the years. But yeah, Toronto moves up to number 5 this week, and we'll see if they move up higher. Number 4, moving up 2 spots from last week, Edmonton. So it's nice to have 2 Canadian teams in the top row. I think that's kind of fun, and it means that when Edmonton and Toronto play against each other, you've got 2 of the best teams in the league right now. For the Oilers, impressive result tonight in Seattle. They avoided the dreaded comeback by the Seattle Kraken. Barely, but they did. And Draisaitl's playing really, really well. McDavid's playing really, really well. Hyman looks good. Their goaltending's been good enough to get them the wins, right? Some nights it's been very good, some nights it's been average, but they're getting the wins. And for Edmonton, they keep piling up points. I don't think they're going to catch first in the division because the team that's first in the division would have to start losing first, and they don't seem to have any interest in that. That just doesn't seem to be anything they're interested in. But the Oilers are number 4 on this week's power rankings. Number 3, dropping 1 spot from last week, the Caps. The Capitals, they just dropped the 1 spot because I felt like there's a team that deserved to pass them this week. So the Capitals are number 3. However, the Capitals are playing very strong hockey. They get the 7-4 win over the Rangers today. Not the prettiest of results, but they get the result. They beat Boston earlier this week too. The Capitals are definitely playing some really, really strong hockey. So how could they drop? How could that happen? Well, number 2 this week, moving up 3 spots from last week, the Kings from Los Angeles. Yep. The LA Kings move up to number 2 on this week's power rankings, which means they're that close. They're that close. Or are they? Because they're number 2. They've got the best home record of anybody in the league. They're playing just really, really good hockey. But can they catch number 1? Because number 1, still, this week, 3rd week in a row, it's Vegas. The first week, I saw some, Vegas is first. Why is Vegas first? They're not the best team in the league. They haven't lost a game since then. I think they've won 7. Is it 7 in a row they've won now? They just keep winning. They make it look easy. And it doesn't matter if they're down in the 3rd period. They're the best 3rd period team in the league. And tonight, Buffalo tried in that 3rd period. But yeah, Vegas had that one locked down. And there you go. Vegas ends up first on the power rankings this week. So 1 through 32, first power rankings of 2025. And some pretty big movers too. I told you guys in last week's power rankings that we would see a lot more movement this week. And we have. So let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support as always. I will talk to you again soon.